Welcome to Deep Dive. Welcome. We're thrilled to have you here. Let's dive in and grow together.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a pretty complex and controversial issue that Elon Musk has really thrust into the spotlight recently. You know, the UK grooming gang scandal. You might have seen some of his posts on X, formerly Twitter, of course, where he poses this pretty provocative question. Ever heard of Christian phobia, Sikh phobia, Hindi phobia? Me neither. Interesting, isn't it? So first, let's get some context.
UK's rape gangs involving Pakistani men are back in the news. And in the past few hours, social media platforms have become a battleground for heated debate. And the topic is the grooming gang scandal in the UK. From Elon Musk to UK's former Prime Minister and even J.K. Rowling, they have all raised the issue. According to reports, thousands of young girls have become a target of these grooming gangs.
Today, we're going deep into Broken and Betrayed. It's Jayne Senior's first-hand account of the Rotherham Abuse Scandal, told by the woman who fought to expose it. We'll unpack the shocking details of the abuse. We'll look at Jayne's fight for justice and examine the systemic failures that allowed this to go on for so long. So Jayne Senior starts her story in Rotherham, and it's a town she describes with a really deep sense of familiarity. She talks about close-knit families and a really strong community spirit. And this is especially true for Jayne. She was incredibly close to her father and her grandparents who lived in Middlesbrough. And she even recounts this really humorous anecdote about her grandfather, who nicknamed her No Change Jane. And it was all because of this childhood shopping mishap. Just imagine being sent to the shop with a few coins and returning with sweets, chocolates, and tights instead of your granddad's woodbines. It's kind of a lighthearted glimpse into her early life. Before tragedy struck, when Jayne was just 17, she experienced a devastating loss. Her mother suddenly died from a heart attack. And this event, deeply impacted her. It really shaped her perspective on life and family. And then, years later, we see Jayne as a young mother herself, raising her son Lee with her partner Paul. And life wasn't always easy for her, but she was determined to create a stable and loving home for her son. Jayne juggled motherhood with various jobs. She even worked at a hostel for homeless youth at one point. And I think this experience really exposed her to the challenges that young people face. It kind of planted the seeds for her future path.
At a local youth club that really ignites this passion in her, this deep desire to support vulnerable girls. And it's here that Jayne encounters the dark reality of CSE. In her book, she recounts the story of Fiona, a young girl abused by a network of men. And this becomes a turning point for Jayne.
Before we kind of jump into the real nitty-gritty, I think it's important just to define what we mean when we say child sexual exploitation. CSE, it's not just about isolated incidents of abuse, right? It actually involves this pattern of manipulation and coercion, often by organized groups, to exploit children for sexual purposes. And makes it even more insidious is that the victims often don't even see themselves as victims. They might believe that they're in a consensual relationship.
Which makes it incredibly difficult to detect and address.
It was around the same time that Jayne landed at a part-time job with this new project called Risky Business. And this project was specifically designed to help young girls who were involved in or at risk of sexual exploitation. Little did Jayne know that this would become her life's work, consuming her for over a decade and a half. The early days of Risky Business were challenging. Jayne and her team operated out of this cramped, dingy office. In a former secure unit, they had limited resources and no clear definition of their role. But they were all united by this shared commitment to helping these girls. And their work began by going directly to the source. They visited hostels, and they met with young women who were already caught in the web of exploitation. And these early encounters painted a really stark picture of the realities these girls faced. One of the first girls Jayne connected with was named Allison. Allison was living in a children's home, and she was so traumatized that she'd only speak to Jayne from the confines of a locked bathroom. This encounter highlighted the profound fear and vulnerability of these young victims. Allison's story revealed the brutal reality of what these girls were enduring. She was being pimped out to multiple abusers, often by an older man who had initially presented himself as her boyfriend. And this tactic of feigning affection and trust was a recurring theme in the cases Jayne encountered. As Jayne and her team delved deeper, they started to uncover these disturbing patterns of abuse. Young girls, often from troubled backgrounds, were being targeted and groomed by older men. These men used gifts, attention, and affection as weapons to manipulate and control their victims. They would isolate the girls from their friends and families, making them dependent and vulnerable to abuse. The methods were calculated and insidious. They preyed on the girls' need for love and security.
As Jayne and her team worked with these girls, many from troubled backgrounds and in foster care, this chilling pattern starts to emerge. The abusers were predominantly men of Pakistani heritage operating in these organized networks. So this wasn't just about individual predators. This was systematic, calculated exploitation. And what's even more horrifying is that when Jayne tries to raise the alarm to bring this information to the authorities, she's met with resistance, almost disbelief.
Now, going back to the investigation, there were small victories along the way. Operation Central, a police investigation spearheaded by a sympathetic officer named Matt Jukes, resulted in the conviction of some abusers. But Jayne knew this was just a drop in the bucket. The lessons learned review that followed Operation Central. It failed to address the systemic issues that allowed the abuse to flourish. Risky business continued to face resistance from the authorities, their warnings falling on deaf ears. Despite the constant roadblocks, Jayne and her team refused to give up. They knew these girls deserved better. They were determined to find a way to break through the barriers of denial and apathy that protected the abusers and silenced the victims. But then there was this glimmer of hope. Adele Weir came onto the scene. She was a lawyer tasked with researching child sexual exploitation in Rotherham. And Adele, she brought this meticulous approach to the investigation. She really dove deep into risky businesses' files, meticulously documenting their findings. But our investigation took a chilling turn. Crucial files containing really vital information about abusers and their victims had just vanished. There was no sign of forced entry. And this led Jayne and Adele to this very disturbing conclusion. Someone within the council was deliberately trying to bury the truth. And this apparent sabotage, it only strengthened Jayne's resolve. It confirmed her suspicions of a cover-up, a deliberate attempt to silence risky business and protect those in power. But despite this setback, Jayne and her team pressed on. Their commitment to uncovering the truth was unshaken. They continued to work with victims, each case, more harrowing than the last. They encountered Katrin, a young girl forced into prostitution by her abuser, and they dealt with this disturbing incident involving a so-called snuff movie that resulted in a young victim being wrongly accused. And these experiences, they really took a toll on Jayne, but she refused to be deterred. She drew strength from her own personal experiences.
It's almost unfathomable that even with this independent report, the authorities didn't take immediate action. And then the unthinkable happens. Laura Wilson, a young girl under risky business's care, is tragically murdered. This should have been a wake-up call, right? A moment of reckoning. But instead of addressing these systemic failures, the authorities, they double down on their attempts to silence Jayne. Risky business is dissolved, and Jayne is transferred to a different department.
It's a clear attempt to bury the problem, right? To get rid of the person who's shining a light on it. And it raises this really crucial question. How could a system designed to protect children fail so spectacularly? What were the specific breakdowns in social services, the police, the council, that allowed this abuse to continue for so long? Jayne, however, refuses to be complicit in this cover-up. She makes this incredibly difficult decision to leave the council altogether. And this brings us to a pivotal moment in Jayne's journey. Frustrated and disillusioned by the lack of action, Jayne decided to take a drastic step. She connected with Andrew Norfolk, an investigative journalist from the Times, and made the bold decision to share her story and the mountain of evidence she had collected. Now, this was a risky move. It meant exposing herself and risky business to potential backlash and scrutiny. But Jayne knew that remaining silent was no longer an option. And Andrew's articles in the Times, they sent shockwaves through the nation, exposing the horrific scale of the abuse in Rotherham and the council's complicity in covering it up. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. Jayne was called to testify before the Home Affairs Select Committee, a platform that finally gave her a voice on a national stage. And her testimony was a powerful indictment of the systemic failings that allowed these crimes to continue for so long. It gave voice to the countless victims who had been silenced for years, their cries for help ignored by those in power. This moment of public reckoning was a testament to Jayne's courage and perseverance. It was the culmination of years spent fighting for justice, despite being dismissed, ignored, and even sabotaged. So the 2014 Alexis J. report, an independent inquiry, delivers this devastating blow to those who tried to bury the truth. It confirms the horrific scale of the abuse over 1,400 children. Is that the perpetrators were predominantly men of British Pakistani origin, and this has fueled accusations of a cover-up, motivated by political correctness, and it exposes the systemic failures of the police, social services, and the council.
Grooming gangs abused around 1,400 children there. You heard that right, 1,400 children from the late 1990s onwards. Most of these gangs were made up of British Pakistani men.
Over 1,400 children. It's hard to even grasp the magnitude of the suffering the lives shattered. This report, coming after years of Jayne's tireless advocacy, finally forces those in power to face the consequences of their inaction. Resignations follow, investigations are launched, and public anger just boils over. But it's a victory, tinged with immense sadness. So many lives could have been spared if people had listened to Jayne and others who tried to raise the alarm earlier. But Jayne's fight doesn't end with the exposure of the Rotherham scandal. She recognizes that this isn't an isolated incident. The factors that allowed CSE to flourish, the vulnerability of certain populations, the societal blind spots, the failure of institutions to protect children, exist everywhere. And so she expands her advocacy work, raising awareness about CSE nationwide. She becomes this powerful voice for change, a force to be reckoned with. So the fallout from the Rotherham scandal extends far beyond the town itself. The Levis-Casey report, a major government inquiry, exposes deep-rooted failings within the council, leading to government intervention and the stripping of some of its powers. It's a clear sign that the government can no longer ignore the issue. They're forced to take action to acknowledge the need for systemic change. But was this intervention effective? Did it lead to meaningful reforms within the council and other institutions responsible for child protection? And all of this, the national conversation, the investigations, the reforms, the increased awareness, it all stems from the courage of individuals like Jayne Senior, who refused to be silenced, who fought tirelessly for justice, who put the well-being of vulnerable children above all else. It's a powerful reminder that one person's actions can have this ripple effect, can spark a movement, can force a nation to confront its own uncomfortable truths. But the Rotherham scandal's impact went far beyond the UK. It even caught the attention of some unlikely figures, including Elon Musk. So Elon Musk, right, this tech billionaire, he enters this incredibly complex and sensitive issue using the Rotherham scandal and other CSE cases in the UK as like a springboard for some pretty strong claims. This firestorm of debate. Some people applauded his willingness to bring these issues to light, while others criticized his approach. Well, he pointed to what he perceived as systemic failures in the UK, right? He blamed politicians and institutions for allowing this abuse to occur. And he also drew attention to the ethnic background of many of the perpetrators. And this was a move that was both praised and condemned. His critics argued that he was playing into the hands of the far right, that he was using these cases to promote Islamophobia. And they pointed out that focusing solely on the ethnicity of the perpetrators ignored the broader societal issues that contribute to CSE. On the other hand, some argued that ignoring the ethnic dimension of these cases was a form of political correctness gone wrong, is that the perpetrators were predominantly men of British Pakistani origin, and this has fueled accusations of a cover-up, motivated by political correctness, that it was preventing honest conversations about the problem and hindering efforts to address it effectively.
This was at best naive and at worst ignoring a politically inconvenient truth. Politically inconvenient, that's why no one acted. They thought that if they pointed fingers, they would be branded racist. Because the perpetrators were mostly Pakistani men. Perhaps the same attitude exists now. The Labour Party, the ruling party in the UK, has 11 British Pakistani MPs. Polls show that 40% of Britain's Pakistani community voted for Keir Starmer. Is that why he is not ordering an inquiry? To appease the Pakistani community? If yes, he is repeating the same mistakes of Rotherham. Pointing out the role of Pakistani men is not racist. In fact, it should trigger questions. Why is this one community perpetrating such abuses? Why are they targeting white girls? Could there be a religious angle to it? Could community leaders be complicit? We are not saying draw conclusions, but certainly these questions need to be asked because young lives have been destroyed by these perpetrators.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Rotherham Abuse Scandal and its wider ramifications, I think we're left with more questions than answers. How do we balance the need for open and honest dialogue with the dangers of amplifying hateful rhetoric? How do we ensure that the voices of survivors are heard and believed, while also addressing the complex societal factors that contribute to CSE? How do we hold institutions accountable for their failures without resorting to simplistic explanations or scapegoating? These are challenging questions, but they're ones that we must grapple with if we truly want to create a safer and more just world for children. I think Jayne Senior's story is a testament to the power of one person to challenge a broken system, to fight for what's right even when the odds seem insurmountable. It reminds us that each of us has a role to play in protecting vulnerable children, in speaking up against injustice, and in holding those in power accountable. We can't afford to be silent. We can't afford to look away. The well-being of our children, the future of our communities, depends on our willingness to confront these difficult issues head-on. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive. I hope it's given you new insights into this complex and tragic issue.